Production funding is provided by A. Reddix and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Welcome to Another View. Think back to what you learned about the Civil War and the ending of slavery. Did you ever learn about Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, or James Townsend? What about Major Benjamin Butler? How about the term contrabands of war and what that had to do with the beginning of the end of slavery in this country? It's a history lesson that many have not learned, and it happened right here in Hampton Roads. Here to discuss the contraband story is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University, and the Honorable Molly Ward, Mayor of Hampton. Welcome to Another View, ladies.
Thank you.
And Mayor Ward, I want to say thank you so much. We originally had Dr. Ings, who was scheduled to be on the show, and he fell ill, and Mayor Ward stepped in right away, so we really appreciate that.
I'm sure I can't fill his shoes, but I'll do my best.
Absolutely. Now, before we get into our discussion about the contraband story, Lisa Godley has put together a piece on the history behind the story.
Most history classes never taught where slavery ended. In fact, the story of the contraband was overlooked for centuries, even among classes that studied Virginia history. But here at Fort Monroe, on the banks of Old Point Comfort, is the place where slavery both started and ended, where the Hampton Roads Harbor meets the Chesapeake Bay. It was here in 1619 that Africans first set foot on American soil. They were originally introduced as indentured servants, but not long after that, as slaves. Fast forward almost 2.5 centuries later, and this very location is where 3 runaway slaves, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, sought refuge and found freedom.
When we think about great people in American history, I think it's important to put Baker, Mallory, and Townsend in that list.
The slaves, in finding and fighting for their own liberation, liberated our nation.
The slave's owner, Colonel Charles Mallory, sent the 3 slaves to Sewell's Point to work on the Confederate battery. But Baker, Mallory, and Townsend had other plans.
Slave owners tended to convince themselves of their own ideology, that these people were not really people, they were just property. And so they treated them frequently like furniture. And they would talk about some of the most sensitive items right in front of them, assuming that they just wouldn't understand what was going on. So the reasons that Townsend, Baker, and Mallory ran away was because they knew what the Confederates' plans were. Mallory, Baker, and Townsend rode out to Fort Monroe and applied for asylum on the grounds that their masters, who were loyal to the Confederacy, were going to take them south to work on the batteries for the Confederacy. All 3 of these men had families. And so one of the most important of their concerns was they were going to be separated from their families if they were taken away.
Colonel Mallory demanded that they be returned, but Union Commander Major General Benjamin Butler refused.
When an emissary of Mallory's came the next day asking, what about these slaves? And the colonel wants them back. And Butler said no. And then the emissary said to him, how about the fugitive slave law, which is still in effect in this country, whereby you're supposed to return runaway slaves to their masters? And Butler said, well, actually, that law does not pertain to foreign countries. And since the Confederacy regards itself as its own nation, it doesn't apply. Too bad. Goodbye.
Butler declared Baker, Mallory, and Townsend contraband of war. His actions opened the floodgates.
And with that, more slaves started coming to Hampton to get behind Union lines. And in fact, 10,000 ran to get behind Union lines at Fort Monroe. They came from Shirley, Berkeley, Friendly, Westover, Carter's Grove. They came 200 miles out of North Carolina. They came from Norfolk, Portsmouth, Princess Anne, Grayson, Nansemond, York counties. If they could just get there, they were going to be free. And that's why they called it the Freedom's Fortress.
I think we are where we are today because there were people like, again, Shepard, Mallory, and Baker. Had they not taken that brave step, then who knows? I don't think we would be as far as we are today.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
So how come we're just now really finding out about Shepard, Mallory, Baker?
Well, I would say some people are just finding out about them. A lot of historians in the area have known for many years. In fact, when I was working on my dissertation in the late 1980s, Dr. Ings had already written his book, and so it was out there. But the story doesn't fit into the American narrative, and the American narrative is pretty much what President Bush said back in 2007 at Jamestown, that since 1776 we've all been free. Well, obviously that's not the case. And so to make that the case, you have to ignore the real history. And this is part of America's real history. And I think it's an exciting part of our history that really shows that the democratic experiment that became the United States of America did not just spring forth out of the ground, that it's been a struggle, that it's in some cases one step forward and two steps backward, and that if you want this democratic experiment to work, you have to be actively involved. And that to me is the story of the contrabands. It's the story of the Civil War, it's the story of the Civil Rights Movement. It's many of these stories together.
So, Mayor Ward, do you think that if BRAC had not decided to close Fort Monroe, that this history would have remained less popular or less well known?
Absolutely. I think it would have remained a knowledge base within the historic community, the scholarly community. I think that the closure of the base has brought a lot of this forward, and as you know, the 150th anniversary of the escape of these three gentlemen to Fort Monroe and the 150th anniversary of the decision is right around the corner. So I think the interest is really building as we get closer to the 150th anniversary.
Let's talk about Benjamin Butler, the general, because when I was coming through school, and I think when a lot of people in our age range, we were taught that Abraham Lincoln, for example, was a very benevolent gentleman, and that's why he freed the slaves. And then subsequently you learn it was more economics and so forth. But how will Benjamin Butler then be perceived? Are we looking at him now as kind of the savior who, you know, put his foot down and said, no, I'm not going to give you back these slaves, or was there other motives behind that, Cassandra?
I think that we have a tendency of treating people who lived in the past, who were great men and women, as iconic figures when they were human beings, and there were complex motivations involved in everything that they did. And the same was true for Benjamin Butler. When you read the narratives of missionaries and freed people during this period, you see that Butler was loved because he insisted that many of these contrabands and then later on they would be freed individuals, or even the free blacks, were treated fairly, that they were paid by the government. And while there were problems even with that, there were abuses and so forth, he generally would step in the breach and ensure that they were treated fairly. But for many white Southerners, they saw him as a beast. In fact, when he was sent down to New Orleans to be the commander of the Union forces in occupied New Orleans, Lincoln thought that he was getting him out of the way after this decision to stay out of trouble. But when several of his officers had the contents of chamber pots dumped on their heads by some white women who were of high standing in the community, and he locked them up and basically said they were like women of ill repute and should be treated as such, then he got the name of Beast Butler. And he got the name of Spoons Butler because he, like many of the other commanders, had a penchant for, as they foraged for food, sending troops out to raid the plantations, he would raid it of any silver and gold and so forth that they had. And so he was a complex individual.
Where did his abolitionist tendencies come from? Do we know, what do we know about his background?
Well, he was an attorney, and it did not seem from his politics that that he was really an abolitionist. It's not until because he was a political appointee as a major general, but it seems as if once he was there at the fort and once people started coming in, even he was returned back to the fort in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Once he came back, he seemed to have set into place certain rules governing how African Americans were to be treated, and he was very open to the missionaries doing a lot of their work, even though the first missionaries wouldn't arrive to the fort until September of 1861. That was after Butler had been sent to New Orleans. But it seemed as if once the nation was on that course, he really stepped up to the plate and decided to defend the rights of African Americans, even though it would take the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments for many of those rights to be officially put in place.
Ma'am, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, I believe Benjamin Butler only got to Fort Monroe the day before.
2 days.
2 days before the gentleman.
Before the gentleman actually showed up.
Right, right. So I don't think he had a lot of time to formulate any ideas. I think it was sort of a decision made on the fly, so to speak, you know.
Some people say this is Black history. Others argue this is American history. I want to get your reaction.
Oh, I absolutely think it's a story of national significance and national importance. That's why I think it's so important that we have a National Park Service unit there to tell this story about the first African Americans to arrive in the American colonies, the first African American child born in the American colonies, and then the contraband slave decision and the story of the gentleman who escaped there and all the enslaved Americans who sought sanctuary at Fort Monroe and in the ruins of the burned city of Hampton. I think it's so important. So much African American history has been lost and has been untaught. You know, we have a unique opportunity, it's not a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I would argue it's a once-in-several-century opportunity to preserve something once and for all. Old Quarters 1, where the decision was made, is standing just as it was in 1861. The parade grounds are very similar, if not identical, to the way they were in 1861. And you have this opportunity to create a living, breathing museum where people could go and at least try to imagine what it was like to be those enslaved Americans who had to escape with the clothes on their back to Fort Monroe for sanctuary.
Now, I know there's been a lot of controversy, and both of you have been involved in kind of the controversy of what to do with Fort Monroe, and should it be a national park, or should it be a museum, or should it be development, and so forth. But where do you think the history will fall in whatever decision is made?
Well, my hope is that it would become a national park and a museum. And if development is there, development should be limited so that we spare what is so critical to America's history. And it's interesting to me when historians have written about the Civil War, often they'll mention Virginia, but they don't tell it in the fullest context of the importance that Virginia had in the whole history of the Civil War and the critical moments that happened here that happened nowhere else in the nation. And for us to preserve that as it was, I think is so important. It's a reminder that this is a history that transformed our nation now and forever. And we should preserve and remember and commemorate that history as a living legacy, not something that we have to go back and recreate as we did with Williamsburg, but rather these buildings, these places are here now, and that they're still standing, and that they can trace their history back to that point in time. I think is critical. I'm hopeful that if it is agreed that there would be some development, then the respect of the past, actually it brings people there. So development needs to understand that there's a reason why people come to a place. It's not just because the place, a building exists, but rather there's meaning and significance to that place.
It seems like such a no-brainer. So why the fight?
I don't think there's a fight. Everyone recognizes how important this is, and I think the National Park Service is committed to creating some sort of unit there. It's all a budget constraint problem at this point in time. You know, the National Park Service has a $9 billion or $10 billion maintenance backlog, depending on whom you talk to. But in my opinion, you know, if Monticello was for sale, we'd find a way to buy it. If the Washington Monument fell over tomorrow, we'd find a way to get it back up. And so we can find the money to do this. It's that important. And you know, one of the ironies is that Benjamin Butler declared these human beings contraband, you know, property. And so, you know, that
it's kind of the reverse, using what the South was saying all along, that slaves were property, but actually using that against them in order to free them.
Right. And so I think that you can look at that as, and in the entire history of slavery, as, you know, an example of, obviously, of the dehumanization of your fellow man, and that still goes on today. You know, that's how we cope with dealing with tragedies in other parts of the world. And so I think it has relevance today. It's not just a historical lesson, it's also relevant to how we teach our children about how you teach your fellow man.
You grew up in Hampton?
Yes, I did.
Did you learn about Townsend and Mallory and
Absolutely
Shepard?
not. Absolutely not. I did not know anything about them. I had the Virginia history book every other fourth grader got issued to them in school, and I never knew anything about the contraband slave story. Spent my childhood going to Fort Monroe, spent a lot of time there, have walked the moat countless times, been to the Case Museum more times than I can count. I learned about Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Edgar Allan Poe, but I never knew about the contraband slaves.
Do you have kids?
Yes, I do.
And are their history books catching up?
I don't think the history books have caught up yet, and
No.
I think that's an important part of this.
And you know why? Because you don't have historians writing those history books. You have writers who are actually yielding to people talk about political correctness, but they're not really talking. They're talking about political expediency and having a certain frame of mind that fits into a political concept. But history should be free of that, and as much as possible. And historians need to be the ones writing those books, and even if it means working with a writer so that the age-appropriate level is a part of it, but making sure that that history is there, I think is critical to not only making good citizens, but to making people proud of where they live and informed about their environment. That's what gets people excited about it. Yes.
Take me back for a minute and paint a picture of what it must have been like, what the circumstances were as these three slaves ran across to Fort Monroe seeking help. And what was going on? What was going on with their families?
Well, Hampton was burned.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of them was actually married to a free black woman, and that was not uncommon. That you had enslaved people and free blacks marrying each other. But the whole area was in an uproar, as you can imagine, because the Confederacy was locking down. That's why the Union abandoned the Gosport Navy Shipyard, which is what we call the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, because they were locking down these areas. They knew they could not really hold it. And they thought the war was going to be a short war. So let's consolidate our forces in these areas like Fort Monroe that we can really defend. And the Confederates were frightened. They knew that right across the water with a gun that could shoot all the way across, you had a fort and you had a benchmark area for the Union forces. But yet you had all this labor in the area, the enslaved people as well as poor whites. And this was the labor that they wanted to make sure they utilized. But this was also the labor that was always vulnerable. This was a big underground railroad departure point. And there was already so much concern and fear about the escaping of slaves from this area. There were even people who came from the Richmond area who came down here to escape, even though there was a big underground railroad departure point
and
there.
And they were further north.
And so this was already an unstable area as far as they were concerned regarding slavery. This was the place where, you know, Virginia's largest export was in slave labor. They sent thousands of people to the lower south, to the Black Belt, that produced 7/8 of the world's cotton production. Wow. And so you're talking about a lot of money, a lot of human labor that really was worth millions and millions of dollars. And so the state was already putting in a lot of money to inspect all the ships coming in and out of this area, the riprap area where Fort Wool is located. That's where they had to stop and allow their ships to be inspected. You had night watchmen as well as day watchmen. You had really a police state environment in this area, and it was heightened once the war began. In fact, during the time that the 3 men escaped, and right at the time when Butler decided, and remember, he was a lawyer, so he knew the law. He knew that he had to find a way within the law to make this right. Because if he did not do that, Lincoln was in danger of having the border states join the Confederacy. So he knew he had to walk a very fine line. And so this was a time period when there was considerable uncertainty about what course to take, how far to take certain things. Even John Fremont in Missouri tried to kind of do what Butler did, but actually go even further in saying that, you know, anybody who was enslaved it should be protected by the Union, and Lincoln actually snapped him back and said, no, we're not going to go that far. So in this area, you know, that whole environment was very, very critical. And when Shepard and Mallory and Townsend, Mallory, Townsend, and Baker left, the missionaries who came here talked about how angry and mean and nasty many of the people were in the Norfolk area, and I'm talking about the whites in the area, because they were so afraid of what might happen. So this environment was almost crackling with anticipation and fear.
And when that came, you've been spending time, you've been talking with elected officials and others about what to do. What is their reaction when they hear the story and they hear the history?
Universally, it's been emotional, a lot of surprise. A lot of people do not know the story. A lot of elected officials don't know the story. I will say that our congressional delegation is all very aware of the story, especially now, and has been incredibly supportive of the National Park Service effort. Senators Webb, Warner, Congressman Scott, Ridgel, Forbes, and Whitman, all of them have been 150% on board. So we have an extreme amount of respect for the story and an extreme amount of respect for Fort Monroe in our local elected official delegation. And the city of Hampton has passed a unanimous resolution in favor of this effort. So, but it needs more attention. And so shows like this are great. When we hear from Dr. Newby Alexander, I mean, you know, what a great authoritarian on the subject, and so it makes it really exciting.
So where do you think we go from here? How do we continue to tell this story and to get it in the history books, other than you writing the next one?
Well, you know, I'd like to see the community see the relevance, the importance of this, the need to preserve this, to get on the bandwagon and say, yes, we need to make this our national story, because it is a national story. Just because it's not being told right now to the nation doesn't mean it shouldn't be. And I think that as more and more elected officials, as more and more community organizers, as more and more parents are aware of this story, teachers are aware of this story, and insist that this story be included in the textbooks, then it begins to have a ripple effect, and the rest of the nation will begin to hear about this story and see its importance.
How are the people of Hampton? I know that there are certain groups that have been working very diligently towards this, but I'm talking about in general. What's the reaction from the people of Hampton? Oh,
they're enormously and completely supportive. You know, as I was saying, the city of Hampton was burned by Hamptonians themselves rather than have the city fall into Union hands. And the contraband slaves settled in those burned ruins when Fort Monroe got too filled. Enslaved Americans fell over into the ruins of Hampton, and our city hall is actually on Lincoln Street, which I think is really cool, you know, because the contraband slaves renamed our streets. We also have a Union Street. So I'm very proud to live in a small southern town that was held by the Confederates with a Lincoln Street. I think that's really, really cool.
Wow. And on that note, we are out of time, but you will keep us posted, both of you, in terms of what's going on, and hopefully the story will continue and that we can preserve Fort Monroe. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so very much.
I appreciate it. And we'll be right back after this look at what's happening in Hampton Roads. Are you looking for something to keep your kids occupied this summer? Next Wednesday, the Kids Bowl Free Bus will roll into Hampton Roads as part of a 40-state tour. The bus will stop at Classic Lanes in Newport News, and parents can pick up summer bowling passes for their children between the hours of 6 a.m. and 12 noon on Wednesday, May 11th. Now, the free bowling passes are good now through September 5th and will only be accepted at Classic Lanes in Newport News and Spare Time in Hampton. This year, Kids Bowl Free has teamed up with Jobs for Virginia Community Development Corporation for the Strike Out Hunger campaign. Jobs for Virginia will provide free meals for the children bowling at Classic Lanes from June 17th through September 5th, giving them an opportunity to not only bowl free, but they eat free while they're there. And that's good, healthy, positive things for the kids to do this summer. We thank you for joining us this evening. We'd love to hear from you. Become a fan on Facebook or sign up for our eView newsletter. You can always leave a comment on our website, anotherview.tv. Next week, more history, the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders. We'll see you next time for Another View.
Production funding is provided by A. Reddix and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.